Hi everyone, and today I'd like to talk to you about how do you create an adaptive workplace in disruptive times. And I was prompted to present on this by a conversation I had recently with an HR professional, an HR manager at a hardware firm who was discussing and exploring with me the fact that their transformation, their digital transformation was going very slowly. And I started to explore with her why was this the case. And it turned out that firstly, she wasn't seeing the deeply embedded pattern that was keeping the organization stuck in its own old ways, and the fact that all decisions were being made at the very senior levels in the organization, and that was slowing down the agility and the pace of the project, the digital transformation project. So one of the emerging themes for me was that this HR manager didn't see what was really going on in the organization. And secondly, that she didn't seem to have a toolkit around how do you create an agile workplace? How do you create a culture that can adapt in disruptive times? And she did seem to have a culture toolkit, but it was more around engagement, employee engagement. And she seemed to look at culture just through this lens of the employee experience, rather than seeing culture in all of its manifestations and its impact on everything and in the organization, and how the organization researches, designs, manufactures, sells and services its products. So she had a very narrow lens on culture, where most of us know that culture is how the organization functions. And that to me seemed like an opportunity for HR professionals in particular to step more into this change leadership role and to help our organizations adapt in these disruptive times. So this is really what my presentation is about. It's really what my book is about, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change. It's really what I'm passionate about, is equipping HR professionals and managers at all levels with the skills to create workplaces that can deliver, grow and adapt. So that is the objective of my presentation today. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along, and Ria will take those questions. And I'm hoping that you can see my screen. Is that visible to everybody as we speak?
Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. Excellent. Okay, so my name, just a bit of background about me. My name is Siobhan McHale. That's a Gaelic name and pronounced Siobhan. It's a little bit tricky in terms of the spelling. And I was born in Ireland, but I've lived in Australia now for the past 26 years. And my career is really in two halves. The first half of my career was as a management consultant, where I flew in and out of organizations across 4 continents, helping managers to create more agile and productive workplaces. And then after a decade as a consultant with Accenture and PwC, I hit a U-turn in my career, and I loved my job, but I felt that there was something missing, and I wanted and yearned for something more. And what I really yearned to do was to roll up my sleeves and to actually do change from the inside. So I wanted to move from an outsider role, where I was a management consultant for jetting in and out of these organizations, to actually becoming an insider and doing the change work as an executive within a series of large organizations. So I joined a series of international firms as the executive in charge of change. And this is really the lens that I bring to culture, is this outsider, but also this important insider lens. And actually that was one of the motivations for me writing a book, was that I saw that many books on the topic of culture and change were written from an outsider perspective, either by academics or journalists or consultants, external consultants. And of course, this external lens is critically important, but I felt that also we needed to hear the voice of the insiders, the people in charge of change, the HR practitioners in particular, who had a different lens on culture and a different lens on change. And this is the insider lens that I think I bring to the topic of workplace culture. So the second half of my career then was as an executive in charge of change. And one of these change projects I'm going to talk about today, which was at the ANZ Bank, which was a transformation over a period of 7 years. So I'll talk a bit more about that, and 3 key case studies that I'd like to take you through today that really unpack what are the secrets of creating an adaptive workplace, particularly in disruptive times. So that's a bit of background on me, a career in 2 halves, mostly as an insider. So the first of the 3 case studies I want to talk to you about today is Nokia. And those of you who are old enough to remember may remember that Nokia was once the poster child for innovation. It was a name that was synonymous with mobile phones. So Nokia was, as a brand in the 1990s, it was one of the strongest brands in the world, very well known, and a reputation for mobile phones. But by 2013, Nokia was a shadow of its former self, and in actual fact had been taken over by Microsoft. So how did this demise, this fall from being a star to being a shadow of its former self, how did this come about? And you might speculate that it was a failure of technology that led to Nokia's downfall. And the answer to that would be yes and no. And in fact, when I did some research on Nokia, what I noticed was that there were 3 factors related to its culture that actually led to its spectacular and rather rapid decline in the early 2000s. And the first of these factors was really about a culture of complacency. So Nokia was once a very innovative company, but over the decades, a culture of complacency had crept in where Nokia believed that it was a superstar and that it could not be tackled really from any side, that it was not under threat. And in fact, it failed to see the threat on the horizon that was being posed by smartphones. So, and Apple in particular. So this sense of complacency led Nokia to start focusing more on servicing its existing products rather than innovating and creating new products. The second factor that led to its downfall was a lack of diversity within its ranks. So Nokia was a Finnish company, and most of the managers within Nokia had grown up in Finland. They'd been educated in Finland. They'd gone to school there. They knew each other. They were quite insular in their outlook, and they didn't have a perspective of what was going on globally. So this lack of diversity of thinking, lack of diversity in terms of perspective was one of the critical factors that led to its downfall. The third factor in its culture that led to this rapid unraveling was the fact that it didn't have a collaborative culture. So when you looked at how Nokia operated, what you saw was that the hardware engineers were in charge. They were seen to be the top dogs within the company, and the software engineers who made the apps were seen as lesser than. So they were in the sort of lesser position within the company and seen as the underdogs. And if you looked at what was happening with Apple, you saw that, in fact, a different way of operating was apparent in that organization, where the hardware engineers who made the phones and the software engineers who made the apps saw each other as equals, and they were working side by side in order to create smartphones that wowed the customer and that we take for granted today. We've got hardware which is seamless, and we also have software and apps that really work for us and are easy to use. And the combination of these two within a smartphone actually took the market by storm. And Nokia had this technology before Apple did, but it failed to capitalize on this technology, this smartphone technology, because of these deeply embedded patterns within its culture. So it wasn't just a technology failure, it was a failure to adapt that can teach us some lessons. One of the lessons that I talk about in my book is this ability in adaptive organizations. The first step is to step onto the bridge like the captain of a ship. I talk about step one of a 4-step process in creating an adaptive culture is to diagnose what's really going on in the organization and beyond. And when you think about a captain of a ship navigating the seas or the sometimes stormy seas, the captain doesn't spend all his or her time on the deck. The captain toggles between the deck and the bridge. And what does the captain see in the bridge position? Well, he or she, you could see the storms on the horizon. You could see the waves as they start to maybe get bigger or choppier. You could see land or opportunities in the distance that you couldn't see when you're on the deck. So this first step of stepping onto the bridge, getting a perspective that's broader and really diagnosing what's going on in your workplace and beyond is critical to your success in creating an adaptive culture. And often that is the step that we rush. We rush and forget to deeply diagnose what is going on in the organization. So very critical to take the time to diagnose what is really going on and to really be able to bring that to the leaders, that diagnosis, rather than rushing to solutions. And often our solutions becoming our problems or becoming just technical interventions without shifting the underlying patterns. Does that make sense? Or, yeah? Definitely. Anybody got a question at this stage? I'm very happy to stop or take questions if that's helpful for people.
Yeah, there's just an interesting trivia from Tim on the chat that he said Nokia used to sell rubber boots as well. So pivoting from rubber boots to smartphones and then missing the entire innovation towards the end of that within a 10 to 15 year is quite an interesting
yes. It's really interesting. If you look at Nokia's history back in the day, where it emerged from, in fact, before the rubber boots even it was in forestry. And it was in the forestry industry that it started to use phones, very rudimentary phones to begin with. While they were chopping down the trees, the people had to contact each other in the forest, and they started using these rudimentary phones to have conversations with each other. And then they thought, hang on, rather than us being in forestry and chopping trees, maybe we should start using the phones. So they were incredibly innovative, incredibly agile to begin with, until this new pattern of complacency started to emerge, which nobody picked up. You've got to see the pattern early and be able to break that pattern if it's not serving you. So that's the next part of my presentation, where I'd like to take you into a case study that I've been involved with at ANZ, which is a bank in Australia, New Zealand, where I was the head of cultural transformation for a number of years. And over a 7-year period, we transformed the bank from the worst performing bank in the country into the number 1 bank globally on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So a remarkable transformation over 7 years. And when I first walked into the bank, what I noticed was in head office, it was there were 2 very different stories in head office and in the branches. When I walked into head office, I was greeted with a beautiful foyer, a Gothic foyer with marble pillars stretched up to the ceiling, beautiful white sofas, plush carpets that you just sank into, beautiful open plan offices where the executive suites looked out over the bay in Melbourne. And then later that week, I went to visit the branch network where there were 700 branches all across the region. And the branches told a very different story, and they were had threadbare carpets on the floor. The paint was peeling from the walls. There was water often dripping from the ceilings, and customers stood in queues waiting for their queries to be answered, and they were very seldom answered in the way that they wanted them to be answered. So two very different worlds. One, the head office that got the funding, and the other, the branches that were seen more as a cost center. And the diagnosis that we did, which was really important, was trying to identify, well, what was really going on here and what was the solution? Because essentially there was a lot of noise in the community. The banks had become the punching bag. They were hated across Australia. They were seen to be pariahs. They were seen to have closed down rural branches, which were the lifeblood of communities. They were seen to have a lack of transparency on fees. They were really hated institutions. And where would we begin? So we began with diagnosing what's really going on in this organization and how can we intervene in a way that starts to shift the pattern. So what we discovered was that head office was in role of order giver. So it was placing orders and giving demands to the branches who were in role of order taker, and victims feeling like we're just here to take the instructions of the head office. So both were pointing the finger at each other, saying, actually, you're to blame. No, you're to blame. So the head office said, well, customers are not getting the service that they need because the branches aren't providing them with good customer service. So they are to blame. And then when you went to talk to the branches, they would say, well, actually, head office is to blame because they make the decisions. We have no authority. And there are so many delays in getting answers to even the simplest of questions from customers. So you could see that this pattern was going round and round and round and getting worse and more toxic, and nothing was being remedied. So where do you intervene? I think the first point to notice here is that it is a pattern, and patterns are co-created. So if you don't see the pattern, you can intervene in the wrong way into the organizational culture. So if we had just listened to head office people, we would have said, right, the branches are to blame. They're not good at customer service. Let's roll out some customer service training. But actually, that would have been the wrong solution. So what we did was we intervened in a different way by reframing the roles of the parts. So this is one of the key steps that I talk about in my book, is the remarkable power of role reframing. And often you do this by redesigning your operating model. So rather than restructuring, we often go straight to structure. Part of the solution is to reframe the role of the parts, which is exactly what we did at ANZ. So we looked at the operating model and we reframed the role of head office to support provider. So their role shifted from order giver to support provider. So providing IT support, HR support, risk support, legal support to the branches. And the branch's role shifted from order taker to service provider to the customers. So their role was now to have full authority within their region to provide the best customer service that they could to customers. And that helped to start to shift the relatedness, so the pattern of relating between the parts. So patterns are the agreements between the parts. They are often hidden. They are not often explicit, but they are the agreements that keep us locked into the old ways. So we started to see a shift in the pattern of relating between head office and the branches too. We work together to serve the customer. And we help to fuel that new emerging pattern by doing things like saying, everybody in head office has to spend a day working in the branches every 6 months. So what happened was head office people who were in the ivory tower of head office suddenly had to spend a day serving customers in a branch, noticing that there were very poor conditions, that there was a shoddy environment, that they didn't have the systems to provide the answers, that the long queues of customers were irate by the time they actually reached the front of the queue and then couldn't get their query answered. So they began to see that they needed to take up a different role in head office to enable the branches to take up their role as service providers. So this started to fuel this new pattern of working together to serve the customer. And within a 7-year time period, we had seen profits double, the share price had trebled, the engagement scores of employees had gone to one of the highest levels of engagement of any large organization in Australia or New Zealand. The bank was the number one bank on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index globally, and it had gone from the worst performing bank in terms of customer satisfaction to the highest performing bank on customer satisfaction. So a radical transformation over a 7-year time period, very much leader-led. So leader-led change, but HR enabled. So enabling tools, mechanisms, and processes provided by the HR team. Any questions on that case study before I go on to the next case study?
I'm curious if the reframing of roles is the only big shift that was done, or there could be hundreds of others, right? Shifts, smaller shifts in over a period of time.
Yes, great question, Ria. There were multiple projects, but if you try and distill it down to the most powerful interventions, one of the most powerful ways that you can intervene is through reframing, in my view. And I think if you think about role, and you even think about your own day, you get up in the morning and you might be in role of partner to your spouse, if you're a husband and wife, and you interact with your spouse in a certain way in role of spouse, then you might, go down to the kitchen and you meet your children if you're a parent, and you shift into role of parent, and then you go to work, you might shift into role of colleague, talking to your peers. Then you might have a meeting with your boss where you switch into role of subordinate. Then you might have a meeting with your team members where you step into your role as a team leader. You might after work meet with a friend for a drink, and you step into role of friend. And each of those roles, you behave very differently because your mental map of your role is different. So our behavior is influenced by our mental map of our role in a way that is just as powerful as our personality. So this reframing can happen at the individual level, it can happen at the team level, it can happen at the divisional level, it can happen at a whole organizational level. So you can reframe the role of the parts for faster change with less noise. And similarly, even in the same meeting, you can step into multiple roles. You could be in role of listener, critic, coach, negotiator, supporter, motivator. So each of those roles and that role map that you have will influence your behavior in substantial ways. So I think that's one of my key learnings as an insider, was this remarkable power of role reframing. And it's one of the key steps that I talk about, how you can accelerate change through the power of reframing. Does that make sense, Ria?
Yeah, it does. It does. I think reframing is really powerful when you think of it that way, right? That you set yourself in the right, wearing the right hat, and
yes,
knowing how.
yes. So, what role are we speaking from?
Yeah.
What role are we in? And even diagnosing, if you take it back here, diagnosing the role they're in. So they might be called one thing, they're called head office. So that's the given role. That's the described role, where head office. But when you dig underneath that, they've got a role that they're taking up within the culture, which is order giver. So nobody really tells you that. You have to diagnose that. You have to figure that role out. What role are they taking up? They're pointing the finger at each other. So there's multiple roles. You can have a role that they define themselves as, but then you can have a systemic role that they're taking up. And that can often be very different to their defined or described role, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
out of curiosity, and there's also a few questions around the diagnostics part. How did you detect this as the like kind of a big Achilles heel for this company?
yeah, and I think this is where you can't do this with a survey. And this is where I think the skill of a consultant or the skill of an HR practitioner comes into play. You actually have to, you can't use a survey to define this. It needs to be diagnosed and emerged from skill. You need to be able to see it. And the interesting thing about these roles and these patterns is that we are not taught to see the world in this way, because we are taught to see root cause. We are taught to go back and back and back and back, and that's they are at fault. You know, that it is the branch, they are the problem. Whereas in culture work, it's always co-created. The patterns are created in the circularity, in the relatedness between the parts. So we have to rewire our brain to see patterns and to see role within the culture and how the role is fueling the pattern. And surveys can't tell you that. It really is a diagnostic skill that you as a practitioner bring to that situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely.
Are there questions or comments or sharings on that?
I think we can continue on the next case that you would like to see, and then maybe we can tackle more questions later on.
So before I go to the next case, I just want to talk a little bit about patterns and patterns in ecosystems. And we know that in nature is patterned. So if you look at the face of a sunflower, if you look at the sand dunes in the Sahara Desert, if you look at the shape of a shell, if you look at the stars in the Milky Way, you can see patterns. And mathematicians have been able to define these patterns in mathematical terms. These fractal shapes have rules that govern their shape and that can determine how these shapes will emerge and how they will appear. So, you know, even Edward Lorenz, the famous mathematician, talked about the fact that a butterfly can flap its wings in Texas or in Brazil, and it might produce a storm in Texas. So small movements can have subsequent consequences. And that within that seeming chaos, if you look at it from a high enough bridge, you will be able to see order. You will be able to see order within the chaos. So they are not chaos systems, they are chaotic systems. They have an order within them. They are underpinned by rules that we know govern these systems. And these rules are patterned. And we know that the same thing happens in families, that there are patterns. And in fact, we can see families where these patterns are passed down through the generations. Often you can see families where there's a dysfunctional pattern. It might be a pattern of alcoholism, it could be a pattern of abuse, but then we can see somebody within the family breaking out of that pattern and changing the trajectory of their lives. And we know that these patterns exist in our families. And one of the things that I'm saying is that these patterns are also showing up in our workplaces. They are the agreements between the parts. They are the unseen, hidden rules that govern how things operate, how things function. So part of diagnosing what's going on in the culture is to see these patterns. And my third case study is from an organization that I worked with, a very large infrastructure company, let's call it Build It Pro, that was involved in the construction and maintenance of very large infrastructure projects, like it might be a gas facility, an oil facility, it could be bridges, it could be roads, but very large infrastructure projects. And the organization had grown up in a time where there were what was called a soft contract environment, where essentially they put in a price for the work, and then on top of that price, the cost of the work, they got a healthy margin. And what began to emerge was that the organization started to focus very much on relationships with each other, good relationships with clients. And that had served it very, very well in its first few decades. But after a while, the market and the clients started to shift, and they started to say, well, instead of these soft contracts where we pay all the expenses for the provider for Build It Pro and then a margin on top, we want to change that arrangement to more hard contract environments. So hard contracts are where they said to Build It Pro, we will give you a total price for the whole project, and you must manage the risk within that. You must manage your margin within that. And that was a hard contract environment. But the environment shifted, but Build It Pro had remained the same, and it hadn't changed its culture to align with this disruption in the marketplace. So they had tried various things, and then they basically called me in and said, Siobhan, we're a bit stuck here. We know we need to create a higher performing culture and a more commercial culture, but we're really not getting very far. And what can you help us? Can you come in and change the culture? Which was a warning in and of itself, which I'll come to later. But one of the things that I began to notice was that, and Ben was the CEO, let's call him Ben Harkness, and he was very concerned with this because he had tried a number of things, tried to get the organization to become higher performing, but it just wasn't shifting, it wasn't budging. So what we noticed there when we did the diagnostic was that managers in the organization, even though their title was managers, they had stepped into the role of nice guys. And employees had, in this relationship-based culture, had stepped into the role of underachievers. And instead of performance managing employees, managers just moved them around. Underperformers just kept getting moved from one project to the next. There were no consequences. There was no feedback. And the pattern or the agreement between these two parts in the organization was that being liked is more important than achieving. So that pattern was running the organization. And Ben, the CEO, was incredibly frustrated by this pattern. And we met one day and he was saying to me, Siobhan, I'm just really, this pattern shortly after I joined, it's this culture of non-performance is really frustrating. And I said, well, what's happened? And he said, well, I'll give you an example. He said, my head of marketing, Tim, I asked him 3 months ago to install a billboard on the roof of headquarters, on the roof of the headquarter building. But 3 months later, and the billboard advertising the company's services in the locality, it's still not appeared. So there's no billboard. And this is another example, Siobhan, of the lack of delivery, the lack of performance focus, the lack of urgency in the organization. It's just another example of this poor culture. And I sort of said, yeah, I'm sure it must be very frustrating. You sound frustrated. Who have you talked to about this issue? And he said, well, I've talked to the head of finance, I've talked to the head of infrastructure, I've talked to the head of IT, I've talked to you. He talked to everybody on his team except for Tim. So actually what was happening in the organization was that the Ben, the CEO, was actually also fueling this pattern that being liked is more important than achieving. Ben was also in the role of Mr. Nice Guy, and his managers were in role of underachievers. And I said, so you've talked to everybody, but you haven't talked to Tim. And his jaw dropped and he went, I'm part of the problem. And he left the meeting, he called Tim into his office and basically gave him a deadline. And before the end of the month was out, the billboard had appeared on the rooftop. So what was interesting in that example was how this pattern of underperformance and underachievement was being co-created in multiple parts. And actually, Ben, as the CEO, had also been captured by the pattern and had become blind to it. He had stepped into the role of Mr. Nice Guy and wasn't even aware of it. So I think what's important there to note is that, these patterns are co-created. You can easily become blind to them. And in order to change the culture, you must see the pattern, if that makes sense.
It does.
So what we agreed then was that we would start to introduce a new pattern into the organization, which was all about the and, which the relationships and performance on contracts are both important. So managers needed to step into their commercial role to manage both. It wasn't an either or situation. They needed to be more commercial in this hard contract environment. And when you looked at the history of the company, this pattern made perfect sense because it had grown up in a soft contract environment. Relationships were very important on these infrastructure projects in far-flung and often hostile environments. And this relationship culture had helped the organization to survive up until this point in time. But sometimes the culture that has helped you get to this point in time is not the culture that you need in order to thrive in the future. So that is one of the key lessons there. And I will just touch on these points and then I will open it up for questions. And the other thing is just be wary that it's not HR's job to fix the culture. HR has a critical leadership role to play during culture change, but delegating culture change to the HR department is usually the death knell for transformation because HR cannot affect the change completely from its role. So that's a watch out. And then if people are interested in learning more, I do talk about my 4 steps, including reframing and patterns and diagnosing the culture in my book, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change. If people are interested in getting a copy of the book, then there's more to learn in there. It's very hard to cover it all in a short talk, but I just wanted to open it up rather than me talking more. I'd really like to hear from people if they have any questions.
Yeah, there are a few questions coming up, Siobhan, and I think, so one question is connected to the patterns, identifying a pattern. What kind of effort, what kind of skill or expertise do you need to be able to bring this?
Yes, a great question. One of the skills you need is balcony thinking. So you've got to be able to step back on the bridge and see what is going on. So I would say having that view from the bridge is really important, taking a step back. The other really important thing is seeing the connections between the parts. So when you hear something over here, so for example, in the ANZ, you hear, the problem lies with the branch staff. And you say, well, what's happening with the branch staff? They're not providing good customer service, or they're like victims. Then you connect it. What is that connected to? So you ask, what role are they in? And what is that role connected to? Because it never exists in isolation. So you're looking for the connectedness between the parts and how one might fuel the other. So it takes time. It's like riding a bicycle. You might not be able to go out today and see the pattern, but you've got to rewire your brain to see patterns. And once you see them, then it's very powerful. So I would say always seeing what's it connected to that's happening here, but it's always connected to some other behavior, because behavior never sits in isolation. So seeing the connectedness. And if people are interested in this topic, I publish a lot on LinkedIn on different patterns and getting people to see patterns. So you can follow me on LinkedIn to learn more about this. And I do talk about it more in the book as well, if people are interested.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just a quick question. The Insider's Guide, it's because you're working from the inside, right? What is your perspective around consultants, right? Coming in from outside. Does that work together? How do you strike that balance?
Yeah, I think both roles are essential, and I spent a decade as a consultant, and I think it's an absolutely essential role. Because as an outsider, what you see is often what the organization has become blind to. So that's the first thing an outsider brings, is that objective perspective. They can also call things out in a way that isn't sometimes not safe for an insider to do. So they can see what the organization has become blind to, and they can call out what maybe is not safe for those inside to call out. I think those are essential ingredients. And I think as long as you delineate the roles, an outsider can help diagnose and recommend, and the insider must co-diagnose and then implement. And I think the implementation journey is a very often convoluted road where you're trying to get leaders to step into their leader-led role, and you're equipping them with the tools and the equipment and the processes and the systems to make that change happen. So I think both roles, they're working in tandem, having clarity about what each other is doing, and that can be a very powerful combination. And the reason I say an insider's guide is there were a lot of outsiders' perspectives on change from academics and journalists and external consultants, which are really valuable, but also as an insider, that is a different lens on this, which I think is equally valuable.
Yeah. So just curious here, in moving the needle for change within your insider role, right? What were the biggest challenges that you faced? And maybe also the next follow-up question to that is, have you achieved change by keeping the same people?
Well, the first part is what were the biggest challenges? I think when I first walked into Build It Pro, what was quite interesting, I spent the first week at the infrastructure company interviewing members of the executive team, helping me to diagnose what's really going on here. And I met with the CFO, and we spent an hour where he talked me through the financials, the fact that many of the projects, I think it was about 60% of the projects were actually running in the red. They were losing money. We really needed to get this turned around and to improve margins on projects and to get a more commercial culture. For him, the case for culture change was clear and very compelling. He was saying we must get this higher performing, more commercial culture. And as we stood up, we shook hands, we were leaving the meeting, he said, "Wishing you the best of luck in changing the culture, Siobhan." And in that moment, I realized that he believed it was my role and my role alone to change the organizational culture. And I sat down again with him and I said, wow, this is interesting. I want to explore this. And actually, in the past, culture had always been given to HR to effect. Mm-hmm. And I could see that this was part of the problem. So one of the first interventions was to have a conversation at the executive table about who is responsible for culture change, or more importantly, what are the roles of the different parts when it comes to culture change. Because the CEO plays a role, the board plays a role, the CEO, the executive team, the middle managers, the front line, the employees, every single employee, HR, every part plays a role. But what I found is that the roles are not delineated. The roles are not understood or aligned. And either it's given fully to HR or it's not understood and there's a whole mishmash of who's doing what. So one of the greatest challenges is getting that role clarity right at the beginning and that alignment around who is responsible for what during change.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often a misstep.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's what I would say. And I forget what was your second question? I can't remember.
Yeah. So it's about is it possible to achieve change and transformation by keeping the same people on board?
Yes, I think often our default position is to change the people, but actually you can change the people and you might not change the culture because you failed to change the underlying pattern. So a bigger problem that I've seen is people get rid of some individuals. They say, oh, it's that person's fault. Let's get rid of those 2 or 3 people. But actually the exact same pattern is running the organization. So you get rid of some people, you bring in new people, they step right into the pattern and the system continues. So this is why you must intervene at the level of the pattern. And when you do that, you often find by reframing roles that people step into the new roles. So at Build It Pro, we reframe people's roles to be much more less relationship managers and more commercial managers. And all those people that were more relationship managers stepped into role of commercial manager and started to improve the margins on their contracts. They just had a different framing. They had a different mental map of their role. They thought that their role was to make the client happy. So the client said, can you build a new wall over there? Or can you put an extra piece of copper here? Or can you extend that pipe for 3 meters? I would say, sure, I'm in role of relationship manager and my job is to make the client happy. Once we reframed their role to commercial manager, which was to keep the client happy and make money on the contract, their behavior shifted.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective because indeed, as you have said, like we first see the people, right? And then that becomes a default without seeing the systemic issues in the ecosystem. There's a question from the audience, and it's regarding any tool that you might use in terms of the first mindset change. Do you use any particular tool or do you recommend anything?
Yeah, I do talk about in my book and give examples of tools that you can use in terms of mapping. And I think one of the key things to do is and I do talk about the steps in diagnosing, but I think getting people to try and articulate what role are they in, what role are they taking up. Visualizing what's going on, actually drawing it can help take it from internally to externally. And so I think it's really important that, you step back, that you map it. And I do talk about the details of how you might draw that in the book. So I recommend you go there for more detail on that diagnosing stage, and the detail of what we did in all of these case studies is in there as well. So very practical to-do lists in there.
Yeah. So there's been an ongoing conversation throughout this conference around performance management in many different talks, and it seems to be a very hot topic nowadays. And the shift towards more network from hierarchy to network organizations, right? Do you think there is a need to change these HR practices from the get-go to create or to build a new culture so that people can thrive?
I think if you even think about how we are framing people's role as a performance manager, that is the role we are putting people into. And I think if you really reflected on that, you would start to realize what some of the issues around that are, because the assumption is that people and their performance needs to be scrutinized, needs to be supervised, needs to be managed. And I think if we could reframe that role to achievement enhancer or a performance leader, even, it would be a much more compelling role reframe. So I think part of it is how we have framed these roles and stepping back from that and seeing what does that signal to our managers when we talk about performance management. We are signaling to them that this is the role that they're expected to take up, rather than an unleasher of potential or a high performance coach, So I think, again, that these things have different meanings within organizations, and they create patterns of relatedness where somebody's managing my performance. And what does that instill in the organization? So I think, again, we've got to see what roles we're putting people in, and what relatedness that then causes between the parts. If I'm being performance managed, then what role am I in? I'm in as somebody whose performance is being managed, rather than unleashed and huge potential being achieved. So I think it's a complete reframing of roles that we need in our organizations, and redefining of what we mean by leadership.
Yeah. That's a very fresh perspective on this, because typically what you would hear is that let's fix the system, but again, you said let's fix our mindset, right? Fix how we reframe the roles, how we think about what we're playing. There's a question that really wants to go a little bit deeper on the Build It Pro conversation, right? You shared about this one conversation you had with Ben. In a larger scale, this cannot happen, right? You cannot have one-on-one conversations. How did you do this, like on a wider level towards Build It Pro, in terms of supporting that change?
Yeah, so one of the things that we did was roll out workshops to the top 200. So never underestimate the power of working with the CEO and with the executive team. So we worked with the CEO, we worked with the executive team, and then we took it to the top 200, reframing and repatterning at that level over a 3-day workshop. So this was built over a period of 6 years. It didn't happen overnight. And the organisation did turn itself around, and the chairman even said it was a remarkable transformation, and the company was bought because of its turnaround in its performance by an overseas buyer. So, you have to think about and stratify where are the interventions and what layer you're intervening at. And the most impact is at the more senior levels, because culture change is leader-led at all levels, but given that senior leaders have a powerful impact on the whole culture, we tended to focus there. So interventions with the CEO, with the leadership team, and with the top 200, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's always challenging when you're talking about interventions at different layers in the organization. And there's one question on the chat where someone is asking, what if the CEO refuses to recognize this? Changes or blind spots, as you call it. How do you illuminate that?
Yes, I think this is a really good point, and it comes to, well, there's so much you could unpack here, but the first thing is that you can only go, this is where nudging comes in. I mean, I've worked with organizations over many years, and sometimes you think they need to be over here, but actually they're here, and you've got to meet the system where the system is at. You can't, if they're here, you've got to be here with them and thinking about what are the nudges that can get them to the next point, and how can you reveal these patterns in a way that the system can hear them, and that we are speaking in the language of the CEO and of the leadership team. So, I'm not going in there talking about engagement. They have zero interest in engagement. They had very highly engaged people. I'm going in there talking about the business imperatives, their strategic ambitions, their leakage on contracts, their financial performance. So, I'm talking about culture as an enabler of strategy. And that meets the CEO exactly where he's at. He's like, yeah, you're speaking my language. You can help me unlock this thing that's been going round and round and that I've been stuck on. You are going to help me to do that. So it's culture from a commercial lens, taking up our commercial role, not our, speaking on behalf of our multiple stakeholders, not just advocating for employees. We need to be equally immersed in the commercial imperatives from a shareholder perspective, a community perspective, a customer perspective. So, I don't talk about how can I convince them. I talk about how, it's not my role to convince the CEO. It's my role to enable the system to achieve its strategic imperatives with the needs of all stakeholders in mind. So that's where I enter. And if you enter there, it's you don't think of it as how can I convince them.
Yeah. The use of language and perspective in terms of who we talk to is really crucial in delivering the key message. And that's my takeaway from what you're just saying. So given all this transformation and also detecting the patterns and all that, where do you see the key role of HR in all this?
I think HR has a critical role to play as we enter into the next normal, and that is a role of moving from business partners to, when you think about the frame of business partner, you're partnering to the business. So in many ways, you're sitting outside the boundaries of the business. You are partnering to. The business is out here and you're out here as a partner to. And I think the reframe for HR is to become from moving from partnering to part of. You are part of the business. You are a business leader alongside your peers with deep people, culture, and change expertise. And we need the toolkit for that. You need to bring a toolkit for culture and change and people to the table, because I'm seeing managers everywhere looking to HR to say, right, we've got disruption. We're going through this transformation on multiple parts. How can you help us? We're a bit stuck. It's going slow. We're not sure why we're spinning our wheels. This is where HR has the opportunity to come to the fore with advice, with tools, with perceptive analysis. That brings clarity. So I think we've got a huge opportunity, but we've got to move beyond employee engagement as the toolkit to really have a toolkit for adaptation in disruptive times. And reframing our role as part of that. I think for too long we've put ourselves outside the boundaries of the business as partners, and then we wonder why people see us outside of the business and don't choose us for roles, because we're not in the business, we're outside of the business. So reframe our own role as business leaders with deep people, culture, and change expertise.